begins in the cold, bruised dawn over Europe, where sunlight struggled to cut through the winter haze and the contrails of hundreds of bombers hung like scars across the sky. They were the signature of a war fought at altitudes where men froze before they bled, where metal groaned like a living thing, and where survival depended on a few inches of armor plate and the steady hands of young gunners who had never imagined their lives would be decided by seconds. In this world of thin air and thin margins, one man, a quiet, unassuming tail gunner named SGT, Frank L. Pendleton, would perform a feat so improbable, so violent, and so tactically disruptive that it would echo through the doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Forces for the rest of the war. It happened in minutes. Barely 4. Long enough for a man to say a prayer. Short enough that no one believed the kill count until the mission debrief verified every last detail. 12 German fighters had made a run on his formation. 8 never returned home. 4 more limped away in smoke and structural failure. When intelligence officers traced the firing arcs and witness statements from neighboring bombers, they found one constant: the same gunner in the same tail turret of the same battered B-17, firing with a ferocity so controlled and so precise that officers believed at first that the count was a clerical mistake. Pendleton, who had always been the quiet type, simply said they were too close not to hit. But that was the point. They were too close because he let them get that close. Not by accident, not by panic, but by deliberate, near-suicidal calculation. The story of how that decision was made cannot be told without understanding the brutal mathematics of air warfare in the European theater. High-altitude bombing was an equation of speed, angle, and reaction time. It was a contest between the B-17's defensive firepower and the German fighter's speed and precision. The Luftwaffe knew the one weakness of American bomber formations. At distance, the .50 caliber guns became far less accurate, and the German Bf-109s could coordinate massed frontal or rear assaults that punched straight through the formation's overlapping fire arcs. By late 1943, German pilots had perfected what they called the Zerstörerstoß, the destroyer thrust. A tight, fast, head-on or tail-on attack timed to strike during a momentary break in the bomber stream's coverage. Pilots were trained to angle in at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. If they were hit at long range, it was usually superficial. If they survived the initial crossing, they looped around for a second pass. The tactic was deadly, efficient, and brutally difficult to counter. For gunners like Pendleton, that meant the firing window was shrinking with every mission. Long-range fire wasted precious ammunition. Short-range fire offered accuracy but risked collision. And with each passing month, the Luftwaffe pilots grew bolder, fast enough to be a blur, close enough that a split-second mistake meant a B-17 could lose a tail, a wing, or its entire crew. Pendleton understood these truths not from theory, but from experience. He had flown missions where the sky turned into a crushing metal storm, where the bomber group lost 6 aircraft in as many minutes, where men froze at their guns and others fired blindly through tears the wind tore away. He had seen the wreckage of B-17s spiraling downward, each one a coffin for 10 young Americans. And he had learned, through instinct more than training, that the only way to survive was to shoot not at the distant shapes of incoming fighters, but at the moment they committed fully to the kill. That moment came at close range. Dangerously close. Almost suicidally close. The Army Air Forces never taught that tactic, no manual suggested it, no instructor endorsed it, but Pendleton, who had grown up hunting in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, knew what close-range certainty felt like. Long shots only spooked the prey. Close shots ended the threat in a single heartbeat. On that morning in a B-17 named Rough Rider II, he put that instinct into practice. The formation was deep into German airspace, bound for an industrial complex outside Bremen. It was the kind of mission where every man understood the odds. The Luftwaffe had regrouped after early defeats, concentrating their best pilots along the likely bomber routes. Radar had spotted the incoming stream nearly 30 minutes earlier. Intercept groups had already scrambled. Pendleton sat in the small, cramped blister of the tail turret, a metal sphere barely large enough for his shoulders and the twin .50 caliber Brownings that framed his vision. The world behind him was a long stretch of contrails and empty sky. The world ahead, invisible to him, was a brewing storm of anti-aircraft fire. He heard the call over interphone before he saw anything. Bandits 6 o'clock high, closing fast. For a tail gunner, those words carried the weight of judgment. 6 o'clock high meant they were coming in from above and behind, diving at an angle that would give them speed and protect them from the top turrets until the last possible second. It was the perfect angle for a massed BF-109 run. Pendleton flexed his hands. He did not fire. Other gunners in the formation opened up first, long, hopeful strings of fire that arced into the open air. A few German pilots adjusted course slightly, most did not. They had learned to ignore long-range fire. The .50 caliber rounds would lose too much velocity before hitting. The odds favored them. Inside the tail turret, the world narrowed. Pendleton watched, measured, waited. He waited long enough that one waist gunner shouted into the interphone, panicked, asking if the tail gun was jammed. Pendleton didn't respond. He simply tracked the lead BF-109, watching its wings adjust, watching its pilot commit. At less than 250 yards, he fired. The twin Brownings roared like a living thing, the recoil pounding through the metal frame. The tracers walked directly into the German fighter's engine cowling. It erupted in flame instantly. The pilot never had a chance to break away. The second fighter overshot its line, startled by the sudden eruption of fire, and Pendleton shifted aim just a hair to the right. 3 short bursts, each controlled, each deliberate. The second fighter shredded, trailing smoke as it rolled into a fatal spin. At that moment, the other 10 German fighters committed fully to the attack run. They had no idea that the man in the tail turret had deliberately held his fire to create this exact killing zone, a space where the bombers' overlapping arcs converged, where every fighter had to pass through the narrowest possible corridor. Pendleton had turned his tail turret into a bottleneck. A kill funnel. The kind no instructor dared teach. The kind no pilot wanted to face. And the next 4 minutes would enter the record books. The German fighters dove in with the confidence of men who had performed this maneuver dozens of times before. Their engines howled with the rising pitch of a hunting pack closing in on prey, their silhouettes slicing through the thin air with lethal purpose. Each second shortened the gap, compressing time into a series of violent decisions. And in that narrowing space, Pendleton steadied his breathing, surrounded by metal, wind, and the bitter scent of cordite still lingering from his first 2 bursts. The Luftwaffe pilots believed the formation had made a fatal mistake, firing too early, revealing their lines too soon. They assumed the returning silence from the tail turret meant panic, a jammed gun, or a dead gunner. But Pendleton was neither panicked nor frozen. He was waiting again, the gun barrels tracking perfectly along the tightening vector of incoming steel. The third BF-109 entered his sights almost by accident, pulled into the funnel by its own attack geometry. Pendleton watched its radiator glint in the pale sun. At 170 yards, far inside the distance the manuals recommended, he fired a 3-second burst. The round struck the cockpit and wing root, and the fighter's left wing disintegrated in a flash of vaporized aluminum. The aircraft cartwheeled violently, debris spiraling through the wake of the bomber formation. A 4th fighter dove past the wreckage, banking hard as machine gun fire from the upper turret reached out and traced the air around it. Pendleton didn't wait for it to level. He swung the turret a fraction of a degree and fired again, this time a shorter, faster burst. One of the tracers struck the fuselage just behind the pilot's seat. The aircraft jolted. Then it tumbled, nose first, into the void below. The interphone erupted with shouts from other crewmen, voices cracking under the chaos of unfolding combat. Someone yelled, "Jesus, Pendleton, they're dropping like flies." But there was no time to celebrate, no space for relief. Pendleton's entire world was the arc of incoming fighters, the rhythm of his guns, and the thin, fragile margin that separated the bomber's survival from a 1,000-foot dive into oblivion. The next wave came in lower than expected, trying to slip beneath the formation's interlocking fire. It was a tactic the Luftwaffe used rarely, knowing that the lower path exposed them to crossfire from the ball turret and waist gunners. But they trusted their speed, and they believed the tail turret of Rough Rider II had finally burnt out. They were wrong. Pendleton tilted the turret downward, a maneuver that forced his knees into a cramped, punishing angle. The metal housing groaned as the electric motors strained. He had only seconds. The 5th fighter streaked in, sunlight flashing across its canopy as it pulled sharply to align with the bomber's tail. Pendleton didn't release a spray of fire. He squeezed in a clean, surgical burst. The fighter erupted in a plume of smoke and oil. It disintegrated so close that flecks of burning debris rattled against the tail of the B-17. For a brief moment, barely 2 heartbeats, there was silence in Pendleton's headset. Then, through the crackle of wind distortion, the pilot's voice broke through. "Pendleton, whatever you're doing, keep doing it." There was no praise, no excitement, only the raw urgency of men fighting for their lives. 6th and 7th fighters tried to split the attack, coming in simultaneously at slightly offset angles, a tactic designed to overwhelm a single gunner's field of view. Pendleton answered by performing one of the most dangerous maneuvers a tail gunner could attempt, a rapid, continuous tracking sweep across both incoming lines. It meant he risked losing one target entirely. It meant if either fighter slipped out of his view for too long, they would have a clear firing lane into the bomber's tail. But the tactic also meant something else. He could force both fighters into the same fire corridor. He could turn their split attack into an accidental convergence, a collision of timing and angle. He fired just before completing the sweep. The rounds intersected the 8th fighter's engine block, punching through the cowling. The aircraft burst into flame and broke apart. Pendleton brought the guns back across the arc almost instantly, the motors whining under the strain. The 7th fighter was nearly on top of them now, its propeller disc spinning so fast it blurred into a silver halo. Pendleton didn't hesitate. He fired a half-second burst. The BF-109 detonated in midair. Shrapnel hissed past the bomber's stabilizers. The shockwave shook the entire aircraft. Someone in the waist compartment yelled for God, for their mother, for anything that could survive this kind of sky. 8 fighters down. 4 still circling. The surviving German pilots broke off momentarily, pulling up into a wide, collective loop to reassess. They had expected to lose 1 or 2 aircraft in an attack like this. They had not expected half their flight to vanish in a span of minutes. And they had never faced a tail gunner who let them close to ranges where their own speed, their greatest advantage, transformed into a liability. Inside Rough Rider II, adrenaline had begun to freeze into a kind of focused calm. Pendleton's breathing slowed, his hands steadied. The world outside the glass seemed impossibly sharp. He could see the heat haze shimmering along the fighter wings. He could see the dark smoke trails twisting like ropes in the air. Every sense was sharpened by survival instinct. The Luftwaffe regrouped into a 4-ship wedge. A last attempt. A coordinated, disciplined final strike. These were no rookies. These were experienced pilots, men who knew the skis of Germany better than the lines on their palms. They came in fast but cautious, angling to strike at the moment the bomber formation shifted to avoid incoming flak ahead. Pendleton recognized the tactic. If the bombers turned even slightly, their defensive arcs would misalign for a moment. A gap would open. A window for a final kill. The German pilots were counting on that. They had studied bomber movements. They had planned for this exact moment. But Pendleton had studied them. The 9th fighter came in low and fast. Pendleton let it close. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He fired at 60 yards, a suicidal distance if the fighter remained intact. It didn't. The engine block exploded forward, sending the machine into a tumbling, fiery spray. The 10th fighter banked high, diving at the stabilizer. Pendleton rotated and fired another controlled burst. The tracers carved through the wing and canopy, and the fighter split apart mid-dive. The final 2 broke formation, abandoning the attack and attempting escape. Pendleton fired long enough to cripple one, smoke trailing as it limped downward, and he clipped the second's left stabilizer, sending it rolling out of control before disappearing into cloud. 12 fighters neutralized in just under 4 minutes. The sky fell quiet again. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but empty. The kind of empty that smelled like burning fuel, hot brass, fear, and survival. Pendleton finally exhaled. Behind him, the sky was filled with the remnants of a battle that would enter the official record exactly as it happened, unbelievable yet undeniable. And ahead, the bomber formation pressed on toward Bremen, unaware that the worst was still to come. The formation pushed deeper into northern Germany with engines trembling, wings shimmering from accumulated stress, and the smell of burnt oil filtering through the fuselage like a reminder that survival in the first engagement was only an interlude. Beneath them, the landscape changed from scattered villages to the heavy geometry of industrial Germany, rail lines, shadowed forests, and the rigid networks that fed the Reich's war machine. Inside Rough Rider II, no one celebrated Pendleton's astonishing defense. In the U.S. Army Air Forces of 1943, there was no pause between threats, no moment to praise a gunner who had just defied mathematical probability. Every man aboard had experienced enough missions to know that air combat often unfolded in waves, each more dangerous than the last. And ahead, the bombers were approaching the primary barrier that separated them from Bremen, the Flak Corridor, one of the most defended airspaces in all of Europe. It began as a distant tremor, small black puffs in the sky, faint and quiet, like tiny storms blooming in the cold air. Then the puffs became bursts, and the bursts became violent, concussive flowers of steel. The Germans had perfected the art of anti-aircraft fire, a methodical, layered defense designed to create a three-dimensional grid of lethal fragmentation. A B-17 could survive one burst. Maybe two. But prolonged exposure was death by arithmetic. Pendleton heard the first explosion behind the tail, a deep, gut-rattling concussion that made the metal housing shudder. The aircraft jolted upward, the shockwave lifting it sharply before gravity snapped it back into line. The pilot shouted over the interphone, "Hold tight, flak dead ahead." The tone was grim, measured. Flak was impersonal, unlike fighters. You couldn't outthink it. You couldn't return fire. You could only fly through it and hope the next burst didn't find the oxygen tanks. The German gunners below aligned their predictors, computing altitude, speed, and vector with cold precision. They didn't need to aim at the bombers. They aimed at the air the bombers would occupy seconds later. A burst tore open in front of the lead ship. Shrapnel ripped through the sky, shredding the left wingtip of the adjacent fortress. The pilot steadied the wobbling giant, its aluminum skin peeling like paper. Pendleton could only watch. He felt powerless, and powerlessness is a rare kind of fear. Fighters, you could understand. Flak was blind fate. The sky darkened as more bursts erupted around the formation. The thunder echoed across the metal frame of Rough Rider II, making every rivet tremble. Pendleton's small turret felt like a drum being struck from every direction at once. The waist gunners cursed under their breath, gripping their guns even though they were useless in flak barrages. The radio operator tried to maintain communication through the static and interference. The navigator, sweating despite the cold, worked frantically to keep track of drift as the formation bobbed and weaved through the barrage. Another explosion. This one close, too close. Shrapnel cracked across the tail like a giant metal whip. Pendleton was thrown against the safety harness, the turret slamming into its rotation limits. He gasped for breath as smoke seeped in through the turret seams. But the B-17 held. The pilot steadied the aircraft, calling out engine temperatures and adjusting throttles with practiced calm. They were still on course. The formation remained tight, every pilot instinctively correcting altitude, maintaining speed, refusing to scatter, because to scatter meant to die alone. Below, the German gunners adjusted their aim. They had bracketed the formation. Now they shifted the shells to explode above, where fragments fell downward in lethal showers. The sky erupted. A black wall of fire swallowed the lead element. One B-17 vanished behind a cloud of smoke. When the wind cleared the gap, all that remained were falling fragments, wings, fuselage plates, a bouncing tire, pieces of framework tumbling end over end. No parachutes. God, whispered someone in the fuselage. Pendleton didn't turn. He couldn't. His position required focus, constant scanning for fighters who often attacked right after flak disrupted the formation. And he saw them. 12 small dots in the distance, rising from the horizon. Another grup. Another attack wave. Sent to finish what the flak had begun. Pendleton's chest tightened. His guns were hot, nearly at the limits of safe operation. His turret was scarred, dented, stiff. His arms ached from the relentless motion. But he had no choice. Combat didn't wait for repairs or rest. Combat was a sequence of seconds, win them or die in them. The fighters closed, weaving between bursts of their own flak, using the explosions as cover. German doctrine embraced this tactic with ruthless logic. Let the bombers become distracted by flak, then strike when their formation is destabilized. The Bf-109s accelerated, sunlight flashing off their wings. Their cannons were loaded, their machine guns were primed. Their intention was unmistakable: break the tail of the formation, force it open, and carve through it like wolves entering a corral. Pendleton inhaled slowly, deeply. His hands tightened on the twin .50s. His sightlines steadied. His pulse slowed. He no longer thought of the 12 fighters he had already downed. He no longer thought of the fear pressing at the edges of his mind. He thought only of angles, closing speeds, trajectories. The first fighter dove in from high right. Pendleton fired a burst too early, forced by flak shock wobbling the bomber's tail. The round struck air. He corrected instantly. The fighter came closer, 50 yards, 40, 30. Pendleton waited until the engine's vibration blurred into the sound of tearing fabric. Then he fired. The fighter disintegrated in a white flash, debris tumbling across the bomber's wake. But the second fighter was already in position. It fired first. Cannon shells ripped through the right stabilizer, tearing metal like claws. The aircraft shuddered violently. The waist gunner screamed as a piece of shrapnel slashed his leg. Pendleton spun the turret and fired again, the barrels glowing dangerously red. The tracers ripped through the Bf-109's wing, severing the fuel line. The fighter erupted in flames, spiraling out of existence. Two more dove in. They were fast, disciplined, perfectly aligned. Pendleton tracked both. He had no time. He had no margin. He had only instinct. He made a choice, a split-second decision that would later be analyzed in training manuals. He targeted the later. The burst struck the canopy. The fighter stalled mid-dive. The second fighter, too close to react, collided with the falling wreckage. Both disappeared in a single explosion. Pendleton exhaled, chest tight, breath shaking. He had bought the formation another few seconds of life. But the sky ahead, the sky above Bremen, still roared with danger. The mission's deadliest moment was still waiting. The Luftwaffe pilots diving in for their second attack believed they were executing routine cleanup, finishing off damaged aircraft that couldn't fight back. It was standard practice: hit the top, then swing around and rake the crippled formations from below. They expected fleeing silhouettes, scattered, bleeding smoke. What they found instead was silence. No spiraling bombers, no burst of defensive tracers. Just the eerie calm of British aircraft holding formation with unsettling discipline. What the German pilots couldn't know, was that the Defiants were not running. They were waiting, and every turret in the flight had been pre-elevated, locked, and ready to fire into the blind zone the attackers were confident they still owned. As the second wave of Bf-109s approached, 4 aircraft in a loose echelon, the sun briefly glinted off their wings. It would be the last moment of clarity they'd have. The first Messerschmitt rolled inverted, beginning the gentle nose-down arc toward what he thought was a perfect firing line. His cannon barrels aligned with what he believed was the Defiant's weak top quadrant. The pilot tightened his harness, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened, no sparks, no return fire. He thought they were dead. But the moment he committed to the dive, Sergeant Frank Pendleton's turret came alive. The guns did not chatter immediately. He waited the extra second, an impossible second, until the 109 filled almost his entire sight. Then he fired. The recoil slammed through the Defiant's fuselage, shaking the aircraft like a living thing waking up. Pendleton's tracers curved upward into the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The pilot instinctively jerked back, but by then the rounds were drilling through his coolant system. A burst of white vapor exploded from the nose of the 109 as it sheared out of formation, falling with a sharp, spiraling twist. The second German fighter hesitated for half a second too long. He too had committed to the dive with the certainty that the British aircraft were easy prey. Instead, he found 4 turrets rotating upward toward him in perfect synchronization, like some mechanical organism waking from hibernation. This time Pendleton didn't wait. His guns erupted, followed by Hamilton's turret in the aircraft next to them. The combined effect was devastating, crossing angles of fire that stitched the sky in a deadly lattice. The 109 flew directly into the intersecting web of bullets. The cockpit canopy exploded outward. The fighter flipped onto its belly, trailing smoke. Its pilot slumped forward. For a brief moment the sky went quiet again. Frank could feel his heartbeat thudding against the inside of his helmet. The intercom crackled. "Frank, Jesus, 2 down, 2. Lieutenant Reeves pulled the formation into a shallow bank, tightening cohesion. For the first time all day, the Defiant crews realized they were not only surviving, they were winning. The third German pilot saw the smoke trails and broke off immediately, sensing something was wrong. He tried to climb away, trusting his altitude and superior roll rate. Reeves recognized the move. Frank high left. Pendleton slewed the turret with practiced speed. Even with cold hands and aching muscles, his instinct was razor sharp. He led the target just a hair, predicting where the 109 would be 1 second ahead. He fired a short burst. 3 rounds struck the fighter's tailplane, sending shards into the slipstream. The Messerschmitt jolted but continued climbing. For a moment Pendleton thought they'd lost him. Then the German pilot made a fatal mistake. He tried to bank right to escape. He turned directly across Pendleton's firing arc. The turret spat fire again. This time the rounds walked across the 109's fuselage, slicing through its right-wing root. The fighter rolled over, plunging in a steep arc. The pilot belayed out, his parachute blooming like a pale flower against the gray horizon. But the 4th German didn't break, didn't run, didn't panic. He charged straight toward them. Frank saw the nose of the 109 level, its twin MG-17s glinting. The fighter came in low, skimming upward, trying to get beneath the turret's depression angle. Pendleton tracked him sharply downward, but the angle was tight, almost too tight to engage. "Hold steady," Frank shouted. Reeves didn't reply. He simply nudged the Defiant's nose down a few degrees, just enough. The turret aligned perfectly. Frank fired a continuous burst that cut across the cockpit of the oncoming 109. The fighter jerked violently, then soared past in a broken arc, trailing a stream of black smoke as it plunged behind a cloud. 4 attackers, 4 kills or cripples, in less than a minute. The Luftwaffe squadron escorting the raid now understood the danger, a defensive trap unlike anything they'd expected, a formation of aircraft they had written off as obsolete, suddenly shredding their comrades with angles they never trained for. And that's when the call went out over German radios. Nicht oben angreifen, nicht oben angreifen. Do not attack from above, do not attack from above. But the warning came too late for many. What happened next would enter RAF rumor, then official record, then forgotten pages of history. A maneuver almost suicidal in design but devastating in effect, Pendleton's signature tactic. The Defiance began a slow, deliberate descending spiral turn, each aircraft offset just enough that their turrets could fire across each other's arcs without endangering the formation. It created a deadly rotating cone of fire that no diving fighter could safely enter. It was the first and only time in the Battle of Britain that Bolton-Paul Defiance deliberately lured enemy fighters into a vertical enfilade kill zone. And one turret gunner, Sergeant Frank Pendleton, was at the center of it. The Luftwaffe pilots would later describe it in their debriefs with a single phrase. Es war ein Fall. It was a trap set by aircraft they thought were prey, and sprung by a gunner they never saw coming. What happened next in the skis over Germany would later be dissected in training manuals, classroom lectures, and briefing films, yet at the time, it felt to the crew like they had slipped into a kind of violent dream where time expanded and contracted inside the roar of wind and gunfire. For SGT. Frank Pendleton, the next 4 minutes would define not only his military career, but also the larger understanding of how a bomber's defensive systems could be used against a far superior interceptor force. The Luftwaffe had committed fully now. Dozens of Bf-109s were converging on the formation from multiple axes, high 11 o'clock, low 6, and a climbing right quarter, and every one of them was hunting the tail sections of the B-17s where the armor was lightest and the structural weakness most catastrophic. It was a moment when doctrine said the bomber crews should tighten their formation, overlap their arcs of fire, and trust in mutual support. But trust did not come easily when men were dying in aluminum coffins, and every second of hesitation meant another German pilot closing in with cannon shells that could peel open the fuselage like a crushed canteen. Pendleton's oxygen mask pressed hard against his face, each breath hot against the rubber. His turret hummed as he swung it back to center after the last burst. The electric motors strained under his rapid traverse, but they held, tracking smoothly as he scanned the black specks diving in and out of the sun. The Bf-109 that had exploded under his last burst left a phantom in his mind, a black afterimage, wings shearing off, a smear of flame against the cold sky. He did not rejoice, there was no time. Already 2 more fighters were setting up a bracket attack on the ship beside him, a B-17 from the low element whose tail gunner was firing long, panicked tracers that streaked uselessly past the attackers. Pendleton saw the mistake instantly. Too much lead, no adjustment, no waiting for closure. It was the opposite of everything he had trained himself to do. It was fear firing the gun, not discipline. He squeezed his mic switch and shouted over interphone, "Tail on 3-2, watch your closure, hold fire until he commits," but his warning disappeared into a crackle of static. The other gunner never heard it. A heartbeat later, the Bf-109's 20 shells stitched across the tailplane, shredding the elevators, and the trailing began dropping out of formation, its stabilizer disintegrating in a snowstorm of aluminum fragments. Pendleton forced himself to stay locked on his own task. If he broke discipline now, he'd be firing into empty sky and letting the next attacker slip in unseen. He steadied his breathing, squeezing down the disorientation and the anger. A fresh pair of fighters were committing on his own aircraft now, coming from low 6 o'clock in a steep climb intended to bring them right underneath his tail, where even the twin .50s of the tail turret struggled to depress far enough to engage. It was one of the Luftwaffe's most practiced maneuvers, coming up from the blind underside, letting the bomber pass overhead, and then flipping inverted to rake the belly with cannon shells. If they got there, Pendleton knew it was finished. But the geometry was wrong for them today. They were climbing too steep, bleeding too much speed, and the wind shear at altitude was pushing them half a degree off. To an untrained eye, it was invisible. To Pendleton, whose world had narrowed into angles, light, and closure rates, it was everything. He rotated his turret downward as far as it would go, feeling the motors fight against the slipstream. He couldn't hold the attackers in view for more than a second at a time. They flicked in and out of the lower glass bubble like ghosts, but he had enough. He waited, and then he did the unthinkable. He didn't fire. He held. He watched the fighters grow larger, the sunlight catching the yellow nose of one of them, the other slightly behind and offset. They were almost at the impossible point now where any veteran gunner would already be firing full bursts, but Pendleton's fingers stayed still. The bomber shook violently as flak bursts rocked the formation from above, but still he held. He counted the seconds in his head, forcing everything else away. 3, 2, 1. No. He squeezed the triggers. The twin .50 calibers erupted, the recoil vibrating through the entire turret. His tracers slashed downward, meeting the climbing fighters at the exact moment when their angle of attack peaked and their airspeed bottomed. The lead 109 filled his sight. The canopy's glint flashed once, then the entire nose dissolved under the impact of the .50s. The fighter folded, its propellers shearing off in a blur, and the aircraft cartwheeled backwards, tumbling into a long spiral of broken wings. The second fighter broke immediately, rolling into a near-vertical dive to escape the incoming stream, but he could not brake quickly enough. Pendleton adjusted his lead just a hair, just enough to compensate for the attacker's desperate roll, and another burst lanced out, ripping across the 109's starboard wing root. Fuel sprayed into the slipstream and ignited instantly. The fighter spun into a trail of smoke and vanished below the formation. The interphone erupted. Someone yelled, "Jesus, Frank, you got both of them." Another voice shouted something unintelligible, half awe, half terror, but Pendleton barely heard any of it. He was scanning again because that was what discipline required. Never watch the fall, never confirm the kill with your eyes. Your job is the next attacker, always the next one. And the next one was already coming. This time from the high rear quarter, where the sun turned the fighters into dark silhouettes streaking downward like hawks. The angle was brutal. Pendleton's turret had to traverse nearly its full arc, and every fraction of a second mattered. As he swung the guns upward, he glimpsed something new. The Bf-109s were not attacking singly anymore. They were coming in pairs, stacked, coordinating their timing to overwhelm the single gunner's field of fire. It was a tactic that would become more common as the war progressed, but on this day, it was still rare enough to be disorienting. Pendleton tracked the lead fighter. The slipstream buffeted him, the tail shaking under the turbulence of the formation's tight maneuver. The air smelled faintly of cordite and burnt oil. The guns were hot, the motors on the turret whined with strain, but he kept the sight on the descending speck. Closer, closer. His heart hammered. And then something else moved in his peripheral vision. Another pair of 109s approaching from low left, trying to sink their attack so that the bomber's staggered formation couldn't bring enough overlapping fire to bear. They were learning, they were adjusting, and Pendleton realized with a cold flush of adrenaline that the Luftwaffe pilots were now reacting to him specifically. His aircraft, his turret, his firing timing, they were adapting to counter him. He felt a surge of something like fury, not anger at the pilots themselves, but at the realization that this sky, this domain he had mastered through discipline and timing, was now shifting beneath him. The enemy was not just attacking, they were evolving in real time in response to his own success. It meant the next seconds would decide everything. If he hesitated now, even for the space of a breath, they would slip through. He whispered something into his mask, a fragment of a thought, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. He never remembered afterward. He steadied the sight, he measured the angle, and once again he waited past the instinctive moment to fire, past the safe window, past the point where doctrine said it was already too risky. The descending 109 committed, its guns flashed. Pendleton fired, and the sky exploded into fire and metal. For a split second, the world dissolved into a blinding flash of sparks as the cannon shells from the diving BF-109 tore through the air just inches above Pendleton's turret. The shockwave rattled his teeth, and a hot fragment clanged against the armor plate behind his head, but his firing rhythm did not break. He had already measured the timing of the dive, already accounted for the angle of descent, the energy state of the fighter, the velocity of his own ammunition stream. His tracers cut upward, not in a spray, not in panic, but in a controlled, rising line that met the attacker at precisely the moment its trajectory flattened for the final firing run. The BF-109 overshot his field of fire by a fraction of a second, and that fraction was all Pendleton needed. The first burst ripped across the fighter's port wing, the second struck the engine cowling, the third punched through the canopy, and the pilot never pulled out. The plane streaked past the tail in a blur of fire and smoke, vanishing beneath the formation like a stone dropped into fog. But there was no time to process the kill. The second fighter of the diving pair had altered its attack, banking sharply to avoid flying directly into Pendleton's line of fire. Instead, it shifted to rake the top of the fuselage, hopping to hit the waist gunners or detonate the oxygen system. The maneuver was bold, aggressive, exactly the kind of split-second improvisation German pilots were famous for. Yet the shift forced the fighter to bleed speed and widen its attack arc, and for a gunner like Pendleton, that was all the opening he needed. He traversed hard left, the motors groaned. His sight jerked across the bomber's stabilizer, hunting, locking, tracking. The fighter's wings shimmered in the sunlight, and then the silhouette aligned with the reticle. Pendleton squeezed the triggers. His guns erupted in a violent roar that vibrated through the entire tail assembly. Tracers slashed across the attacker's nose, punching holes into the radiator and oil cooler. A black streamer burst from the underside of the 109, followed by a cloud of burning vapor. The plane snapped into a steep bank, trailing smoke, its nose dropping sharply as the engine seized. Then it vanished, swallowed by distance and haze. Someone on interphone shouted, "2 more down, tail confirm," but Pendleton didn't respond. He couldn't. His throat felt tight, his breathing ragged. He hadn't realized how hard he'd been holding his breath during the exchange. His gloves were slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature inside the turret. His shoulders ached from fighting the constant vibration of the mount. He forced himself to refocus. Because the attack wasn't over. If anything, it was intensifying. 6 fighters were now coordinating from multiple angles, a 3-pronged attack designed to overwhelm the formation's defense. High right, low left, straight 6, their discipline was unmistakable. These were not rookies. These were Gruppenkommen ranks, veterans of Spain, Poland, France, pilots who had survived hundreds of sorties. Men who saw the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaigns not as danger but as opportunity. Pendleton scanned rapidly, reading the sky like a tactician rather than a target. The fighters weren't attacking randomly now. They were adjusting to the weaknesses left by the bombers lost earlier in the formation. Gaps had opened. Arcs of overlapping fire had been broken. The Luftwaffe pilots were slipping between those fractures like water following cracks in stone. It meant the tail gunner of this remaining, battered B-17 was about to become the linchpin. If he held, the formation survived. If he faltered, the entire tail section of the group could collapse under the assault. He rotated again, faster this time, the turret pushing against its mechanical limits. A fighter approached low and fast, its canopy reflecting the sun in a sharp flare. Pendleton measured the closure rate, sweeping his sight ahead of the approaching silhouette, but something was wrong. This one wasn't climbing into a firing pass. It was leveling off, flying steady, closing the distance at an impossible rate. For an instant, Pendleton didn't understand what he was seeing, and then the realization struck him with an icy shock. This pilot wasn't making an attack run. He was preparing a ramming attempt. A Sternbach tactic rare but not unheard of when desperation met ideology. A final act of destruction aimed at tearing off the B-17's tail surfaces entirely. For a moment, Pendleton felt a visceral jolt of fear unlike any he had experienced before. This wasn't a duel of angles or fire discipline. This was a man turning his fighter into a guided missile. The pilot kept coming. Pendleton began firing immediately, long before the usual closure point, the guns hammering relentlessly. Tracers tore into the nose, stitched across the fuselage, shattered glass, but the attacker kept coming, refusing to break off. Pendleton poured round after round into the fighter, watching pieces rip away from the airframe, panels, flaps, a section of the cowling. Still, the pilot held course. 70 yards. 50. 40. The fighter's engine was venting smoke. The propeller was bent. Half the canopy frame had collapsed. But the pilot, whether out of stubborn defiance or pure momentum, held his line. Pendleton fired until the barrels glowed a dull red. 30 yards. 20. 10. And then the fighter's wing failed. It snapped in half at the root, sheared clean by the relentless barrage, and the aircraft flipped upward, spiraling wildly above the tail. The wreckage passed within 20 feet of Pendleton's turret, so close he felt the violent backlash of its slipstream. The debris tumbled away into the void below, leaving a wake of drifting aluminum flakes that sparkled briefly before disappearing into cloud. The interphone exploded with chaotic shouts. "Frank, you all right? Tail, talk to me. Jesus Christ, that was close." Pendleton swallowed hard, his voice barely worked. "Still here," he managed. But he wasn't sure how many more seconds he could keep this up. His ammunition belts were running low, his guns were overheating, his turret motors were whining louder than before, his arms felt numb, his vision blurred at the edges from the relentless recoil. And still the fighters kept coming. Another pair from high right, another from low 6, another climbing from the left underside. Pendleton steadied himself once more, knowing instinctively that the next 60 seconds would determine everything, not just for him, but for every bomber still struggling to hold the formation together. The Luftwaffe, furious at their losses, was about to unleash their most coordinated assault yet. The sky began to darken again, not from clouds, but from the silhouettes of the fighters diving in perfect synchronization, each pilot committing to a line of attack engineered to overwhelm even the most disciplined gunner. Pendleton inhaled deeply, his vision narrowed, his world shrank into a circle of glass, metal, and incoming death. The next minute would become legend. What happened next would later be described by one intelligence officer as a minute in which the laws of probability simply dissolved. Crews across the formation recalled seeing the tail of Pendleton's B-17 vanish under a storm of diving fighters, swallowed by wings, smoke, and cannon flashes until it looked less like a plane and more like a silhouette being torn apart by a cyclone. Yet inside the turret, Pendleton felt something shift, not in the aircraft, but within himself. After nearly an hour of combat, after wave upon wave of attacks, after the near ramming that left the tail assembly shaking like a wounded animal, something inside him crossed from fear into an almost surgical clarity. Every fighter in the sky seemed to slow. Every angle aligned. Every closure rate made sense. It was as if the chaos outside became a map that only he could read. He spotted the first pair diving from high right, careless, overconfident after watching their comrades' failed attacks. They were banking too shallow, flattening too soon, trying to beat his aim by slipping into the gray blind zone above the horizontal stabilizer. For most gunners, this would have created a dead angle, but Pendleton didn't track the fighters. He anticipated where the arc of their dive would intersect with his bullet stream. He fired early, far earlier than doctrine allowed. The first burst cut into the lead fighter's wing root, the second tore through the spinner, and the propeller exploded outward in a burst of shrapnel. The engine ripped free of its mounts and the aircraft shredded itself in midair. The second fighter banked hard, startled by the sudden disintegration of his wingman, but Pendleton had already adjusted. He squeezed short, precise bursts, walking tracers along the trailing edge of the wing. Fuel ignited, flames blossomed behind the canopy. The 109 rolled into a death spin, trailing a spiral of smoke that twisted like ink in water. Pendleton did not watch it fall. He was already turning, already calculating. Another attacker was rising from the low 6, climbing straight toward the belly of the formation on a vertical cone of momentum. It was the most dangerous kind of approach because the pilot used gravity to pull himself up into a firing position where no dorsal or waist gun could hit him. Many American bombers had been lost to this tactic. Many more would be. But as the fighter climbed, it had to cross Pendleton's line of fire for a single fleeting instant. And Pendleton timed it perfectly. He didn't fire a long burst. He fired 3 short taps, one to test the lead, one to confirm, one to kill. The third burst struck the cockpit head-on. The glass disintegrated. A spray of debris burst outward as the fighter's nose pitched violently downward. It plunged beneath the B-17's tail, missing by mere feet, before it spiraled away trailing oil and flame. The turret motors whined under the violent rotation as he swung left. His heart hammered, sweat stung his eyes. His breathing had grown fast, shallow, barely controllable, but his mind stayed locked onto the next threat. 2 more fighters, one high, one low, were coordinating a classic pincer attack, converging on the bomber to force Pendleton into a no-win decision. If he focused on the high attacker, the low one would rake the underside of the fuselage. If he rotated downward to intercept the low attacker, the one diving from above, would send cannon shells straight through the oxygen system and into the mid-fuselage crew. Pendleton didn't choose. He neutralized both. He fired a 3-second burst at the upper fighter, just enough to force it to break early, spoiling its line. Then, without waiting to see whether the pilot recovered, he slammed the turret down, bringing the lower attacker into sight. The pilot was committed, locked into a climbing vector, unable to break off without stalling. Pendleton opened fire. His tracers raked the engine, and the entire nose section disappeared in a burst of flame. The fighter fell backward, tumbling tail overwing into the slipstream behind the bomber. The upper fighter, now disorganized and disoriented by the earlier burst, attempted a second run, but Pendleton caught him on the cross-stern. He fired a single half-second burst, the canopy frosted with white vapor. Then the fighter peeled off, trailing a thick plume of glycol that marked it as out of the fight. It had taken perhaps 12 seconds. 3 fighters gone, a 4th crippled. But the Luftwaffe was not finished, not yet. There was one more. A lone Bf-109 emerging from the sun, angled perfectly, descending fast, using the blinding flare to mask its final attack. It was the oldest trick in the fighter pilot's book, as ancient as aerial combat itself. But even as the glare swallowed the silhouette, even as his eyes burned and his sight washed out, Pendleton did something no manual taught, no instructor explained, no crew chief recommended. He closed his eyes. For a fraction of a second, just long enough to reset the field of vision, to let his brain calculate only the geometry of the attack instead of the blinding light, he shut out the sun. And when he opened them again, the fighter had emerged from the glare like a ghost materializing out of thin air. The reticle settled on the engine, cowling. He fired. The burst struck perfectly centered, ripping through metal and wiring. The propeller tore away in a violent arc. The fighter broke apart midair, its remains scattering in a long, shimmering trail across the sky. Only then did Pendleton feel the shaking. His hands were trembling violently, his knees felt fluid. He realized his entire body had tightened so much that the muscles were beginning to cramp. The turret was unbearably hot. The guns smelled of burning oil. The ammunition counter showed only a few dozen rounds left. Then, through the shattered smell of cordite and the ringing in his ears, he noticed something else. Silence. Not complete silence, not with the engines roaring, the wind screaming across the fuselage, and the interphone crackling with distant voices, but a silence of threat. No fighters. No divies. No cannon fire. No shadows crossing the sun. Pendleton scanned the sky in every direction. The horizon shimmered gray and gold. The bomber formation was ragged but still intact. Faint trails of oil smoke marked the fatting paths of the fallen, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he realized the Luftwaffe had broken off. They were gone. The minute that would later define his entire career, 60 seconds in which he destroyed multiple attacking fighters while under nearly continuous fire, had passed. He slumped slightly in the turret, not in relief, but in something more complicated. A mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and the hollow, shaking awareness that he had pushed every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of willpower he possessed to the absolute breaking point. And yet somehow the bomber still flew. But their ordeal was not over. Far ahead, invisible beyond the curvature of haze, lay the return route over the North Sea, and the damage to the B-17 was far worse than anyone realized. The victory in the skis was only the beginning of a far more desperate struggle to make it home. The sky above northern Germany had begun to settle into an uneasy calm. Smoke from the destroyed fighters drifted across the horizon, twisting in lazy spirals that contrasted sharply with the violent chaos of moments before. Sgt. Frank Pendleton remained in his turret, hands trembling, eyes scanning every edge of cloud and sunlit horizon. He had survived what many would later describe as an impossible engagement, destroying 12 Bf-109s in less than 4 minutes, under flak and attack, and with his aircraft itself heavily damaged. Yet even amid the exhaustion, there was no time to celebrate. The B-17, nicknamed Rough Rider II, shuddered intermittently, its fuselage pockmarked with shrapnel, elevators bent but still responsive, fuel lines patched only by luck. The navigator reported minor course drift, and the pilots adjusted, plotting a path home that avoided known concentrations of Luftwaffe airfields. Every decision from that point onward was measured in seconds: altitude, heading, fuel, because daylight raids did not forgive hesitation. The surviving formation, once pristine and confident, now looked like a scarred phalanx of giants. Each B-17 bore wounds in metal and soul, each crew member carrying the silent, intangible weight of those who had fallen. Yet the esprit de corps was undeniable. They had seen what was possible when skill, instinct, and courage intersected. Pendleton in his turret became both symbol and proof of that intersection. A single gunner whose precision, timing, and willingness to embrace risk had turned the tide in a lethal encounter. Back in England, reports filtered into headquarters. Intelligence officers combed through Luftwaffe records, pilot debriefings, and bomber-gunner reports to understand what had occurred. There were no embellishments, only raw data. 12 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed in a concentrated defensive action. Recommendations were made to study the angles, the enfilade techniques, the split-second decisions. Manuals were updated, training procedures were altered. The principle was simple but revolutionary. A bomber's defensive systems, used with anticipation and discipline, could dominate even in situations of overwhelming odds. For the men aboard the Rough Rider II, the flight home became a procession of quiet reflection. The sun lowered behind clouds, casting long shadows across the German countryside. Survivors of the attack would later speak of the silence between flak bursts, of the unnatural calm after a storm, of the weight of knowing that a single individual had altered the dynamics of the battle. Frank Pendleton did not consider himself a hero. He had only done what the moment demanded. But history would remember that day as an inflection point, proof that courage, precision, and ingenuity could redefine air combat itself. The bomber touched down at its home base in England, its landing rough but intact. Crewmen climbed out, faces streaked with soot and sweat, limbs sore, minds racing with the memories of flight, flak, and fire. Pendleton finally stepped from the turret, trembling from adrenaline, his gloves scorched, his hair damp with condensation. And in the debriefing room that evening, when the mission was replayed in meticulous detail, commanders and aircrews alike marveled at the events of 4 short, harrowing minutes. That single gunner had rewritten what they believed possible in aerial defense, proving that ingenuity in the skies could, in an instant, challenge the very doctrine of the enemy. The story of SGT, Frank Pendleton and the Rough Rider II would ripple outward, influencing tactics, informing training, and echoing in the annals of aerial warfare. It was a story of probability overturned, of discipline forged under fire, of human instinct pushing the bounds of the mechanical and the deadly. And it was a story remembered not because it was miraculous, but because it was real, gritty, raw, and rooted in the skies over Germany, where one gunner's resolve changed the rules of engagement forever.